Hello, friends. We can safely say that Abraham was one of the most important human beings who ever walked this earth. We become acquainted with Abraham in the first book of the Bible in Genesis chapter 12, and later in the book, in the 17th chapter, his name, the name with which he was born, Abram, was changed to Abraham, which means basically that God promised him that he would be the father of a great multitude, or the father of many nations. And the same thing that God did for Abraham, he did also for his wife Sarah, whose name was Sarai, but he changed her name to Sarah, and that's how we know these two individuals. In this broadcast, I'd like very much to talk to you about the 25th chapter of Genesis, where we see in the aftermath of the death of Abraham, the future nations that began to form as descendants of Abraham. Welcome then to our study. Genesis chapter 25 records for us the death of Abraham, one of the most important men who ever lived upon the face of this earth. And before we get into a discussion about the descendants of Abraham that are mentioned in chapter 25, it would be good for us to just notice the thing that is the way in which the death of Abraham was described. Let's go ahead and read from Genesis 25, beginning in verse 7. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer-lahai-roi. What we're told here in the very beginning was that Abraham died as a very old man, very richly blessed by God, and two things are said to describe the way in which he died. We are told here that he breathed his last and that he was gathered to his people. Now, these two expressions are helpful to us in understanding the nature of death from the very beginning of the Bible. There's some discussion as to whether or not the Old Testament actually presents an afterlife. But I believe we have here good evidence that it's this concept of having a soul or a spirit that dwells in our body is implied very early, and Jesus himself argues that if you were to read Genesis carefully, you could very easily see that God intended us to understand that when Abraham died, he did not cease to exist, but he continued to live outside of his body. And the first expression we have here is that of he breathed his last. Now, when we get to the New Testament in Matthew 27 and verse 50, we see that the language when Jesus died on the cross, he yielded up his spirit. Matthew 27 and verse 50. He cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Now that appears to be more than just his breath, breathing his last, or giving up his breath. Here is, the translators have dealt with the problem of the ambiguity of the word spirit and breath, because in the Greek language and the Hebrew language, it's the same word. A wind is described with the very same word as the word spirit. God is accommodating us in our limitations and expressing the reality of the invisible world by using words that we can understand in our physical existence. So he says, yielded up his spirit, he yielded up his breath, he yielded up more than just what came out of his mouth. We see in Mark 15 and verse 37, it just says he breathed his last. But in Luke 23 and 46, listen to what Jesus says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And in John 19 and 30, he gave up his spirit. So Jesus is saying that he's committing something into the hands of his Father in heaven when he dies, and that is his spirit. Now, a little bit earlier in Matthew, Jesus was on the firing line, and you had all of the different sects gathered to try to discredit Jesus, those who saw themselves as being in competition with Jesus. One of those groups was called the Sadducees. These were the priests, the high priest and his family. There was a group of those among the priestly class that were called the Sadducees, and they doubted the reality of any spirit. To them, all there was corporeal existence in the flesh. They doubted the existence of angels and of demons, as well as the immortal soul of a man. So they had a query for Jesus in Matthew 22 based upon the law of Moses, the law of the husband's brother that was required by the law of Moses if the oldest brother were to die, leaving his widow, and his brother was not married, he was obligated to take the widow of his brother as his own, and the firstborn of this relationship was going to be not his, but his older brother's, in order to continue to carry on the line of inheritance in the name of the older brother. Now, the Sadducees posed this problem. What if there were 7 brothers, and one after the other, they died, the oldest to the youngest, and then finally the widow dies. And so what you have here is the second brother marries the widow, and she doesn't have any children, all the way down to the 7th son. None of them have any children, and then finally she dies, and their question is, if there really is a resurrection, they didn't say it that way, but in the resurrection, theoretically speaking, whose wife would she be? And Jesus says, you don't understand the nature of what you're talking about. There is no marriage in heaven. There's no marrying or giving in marriage, but we shall be like the angels, he says. But now here's his answer to their doubt about the reality of spirits. He says, as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. So, in this language, we are being told that the reality is that when we die, we continue to be living. Abraham had died almost 2,000 years before Jesus said these words. Moses had come along about 400 or 500 years after Abraham had died, and he said that God said, I am the God of Abraham. Jesus said, that means Abraham was still living. God is a God of the living, not of the dead. And with these things in mind, we go back and we look at in Genesis 25 and verse 8, it says, Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Now, again, we've got to ask ourselves what that might mean. Gathered to his people, what would that mean? Well, this speaks not of his being buried in a cemetery where his people were located, because very clearly we just read he had bought this burial place for his wife Sarah. None of his ancestors were buried there. And so Sarah had been buried there, and then now whenever finally Abraham dies, he's buried in the same cave, the cave of Machpelah. Today it's a landmark. You can go to Israel and you can visit the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah were buried. And later descendants like Joseph also were placed in the same tomb. Gathered to his people is referring to the fact that his people were living, and he was gathered to them. He was united with his ancestors. They were living as he continued to live at that time. Now, let me take you forward here a little bit, and let's look at the situation with Isaac and Rebekah, because what is important about Abraham's death was that God promised him that he would have descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky and as the sand of the seashore. And yet Isaac and Rebekah, for another 20 years, had no children. Now, God had promised that Isaac would have children, and they had none. So here you have, let me read it with you. It says, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. We need to remember that even though it is God's will to do these things, he promised that he would. And yet it's not inevitable. You and I have a part to play. Our prayers have a part to play. They are things that God cannot do, apparently, except in answer to prayer. God did not give them children for 20 years until Isaac prevailed upon him to keep his promise about children for Abraham and for Isaac. And so the Lord granted his prayer. She conceived, and in verse 22, the children struggled together within her. There were two. And she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name, well, I have to turn the page for that. Of course, they called his name Esau. We'll get back to that in just a moment. I'd like us to just notice the things that are being emphasized here about this relationship of Esau and Jacob, twin brothers. Esau was born first, but Jacob was born grasping the heel of his brother, and that's how he got his name. Jacob as the one who was trying to supplant his brother. He was behind. He was a second, but he was reaching for first place. The supplanter, Jacob. And that becomes a part of their story as we go along. I'd like you to be aware, in the prophecy that God reveals to Rebekah, God says the older shall serve the younger. That is, Esau the older would serve Jacob, his younger brother. And he's speaking in terms of the nations that would descend from them. That rivalry became very acute, as the following chapters of Genesis point out. But even in the prolonged history of the Old Testament, the book of Obadiah and the minor prophets is completely dedicated to the evil of this rivalry. And Obadiah the prophet foresees the fall of the nation of Edom because of its pride, in verse 3, because of the violence toward Jacob, his brother, in verse 10. Another of the minor prophets is Amos, and Amos gives us a rundown of 7 nations that were located around Israel, or Jacob, the nation of Jacob. And he explains why God was going to punish each one, because they were all going to face the invasion of Assyria. And in Amos 1 and verse 11 and 12, he comes to Esau, or Edom, and he says he was to be condemned because his anger tore perpetually. And then in Malachi, the very last book of the Old Testament, the last of the 12 minor prophets, in chapter 1, verses 2 through 5, you find the famous words, "Yet I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated." Coming down to the times of Jesus Christ, we have that rivalry spoken or portrayed in a very dramatic way when Jesus was born. He was born in Bethlehem, and the wise men came from the east. You remember the story. And they stopped first to ask the king, King Herod, about the king of Israel that was born. And, of course, that was first he'd heard about it, and he was not too happy about it. And so he got the wise men together, he got his scholars together, he inquired of the Bible, and, of course, the book of Micah says that he was to be born in Bethlehem. So he sent soldiers, and they killed all the babies 2 years old and younger in Bethlehem. This Herod was an Idumean. He was an Edomite. He married an Israelite woman, Mariamne, who was of the priestly stock, to give himself more validity, but he was never an Israelite. He was an Edomite, descendant of Esau. It's a very sad thing that we have to witness in that story. Coming on down then into that chapter, reading, let's see, verse 27 of Genesis 25. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. You can see the beginnings of a serious tug of war of preference. Mother likes the younger brother because of that bond that they share in tending to the flocks and the field. And on the other hand, the aggressive older brother Esau, the father, looked on him as a man's man and someone that would bring to him the game that he would kill when he was out hunting. Well, the story develops in verse 29. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted, and Esau said to Jacob, Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. Therefore his name was called Edom. And Jacob said, Sell me your birthright now. Esau said, I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? Jacob said, Swear to me now. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. I'd like us to be aware, again, of the practical consequences of the favoritism of the parents, as well as the prophecy itself. What was, on the one hand, an important factor to Isaac was that he was Esau was a manly man. I don't think that Jacob was not a manly man. Obviously, he was very manly, as we see further on in the story, but it was just a prejudice of his own because Esau was a hunter, and there are men who relate to that more than others. Nevertheless, the drama unfolds in which we see that Esau was a profane man. Whenever he came in from the field exhausted from the hunt and hungry, and his flesh is begging for food, Jacob had cooked some stew. Perhaps it's a lentil stew, so it looked red, and of course Esau's name, Edom, meant red as well. But nevertheless, he wanted some of that stew, and Jacob said, what's it worth to you? And Jacob had an interest in spiritual things, and Jacob wanted the birthright that his brother had by only a few seconds that he received by birth. And so he suggested, all right, give me your birthright and I'll feed you. And fleshly minded, carnal minded, profane Esau, why not? What good is it to me? I'm starving to death. What if I die? And so he said, swear to me. And he swore an oath. And so we're told clearly that Esau, from God's point of view, didn't appreciate his birthright, his spiritual birthright that goes back to God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, that in his seed should all the nations of the earth be blessed. And so we're looking at them. God says Esau did not appreciate, he actually despised his birthright. Now we have people today, they're not bad people. And yet they don't seek God, they don't seek things eternal. They live for the flesh, they live for now. They're like a dog, and when they die like dogs. They don't have their eyes on their God or on their faith or in their future. They live their lives as profane people, and they lose so much. And we see that Esau very deeply resented the choice that he made for the rest of his life. Please notice with me Genesis 25 and 34. We just got through reading Esau despised his birthright. In Romans 9 and verse 10, the Apostle Paul says, when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though he were not yet born, had done nothing either good or bad, she was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. That's found then in the prophet Malachi. In Hebrews 12 and verse 15, The Apostle Paul, or whoever the writer is of Hebrews, makes the point that we as Christians can become profane, we can become carnal-minded, and treat each other carnally, look at life carnally, and allow a root of bitterness to spring up, as it did with Esau, between him and his brother. And so he says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, because you cannot obtain the grace of God as a bitter person. That no root of bitterness springs up. He says, don't be unholy, that is profane, like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. I'd like you to be aware, please, that that's the state that we are in today. If we die without preparing to meet our God, if we die without thinking of investing in eternity, if we don't remember that we are not just flesh and blood, we also are spirit. We are offered an eternal blessing. We're offered an eternal birthright. But it requires that we appreciate and treasure things holy, that we seek God, seek His favor, take advantage of His plan of salvation, that we might be forgiven of our past sins, that we might walk in righteousness and not live as unholy or profane people, but as spiritually minded, wise people, and at that endure for all time. Well, that's all that I had to share at this time. Thank you for spending your time with me at this time. May God bless you in the days to come.